program going on.
Well, yeah, because unlike the photographs that we talk about, there's no room for interpretation here. When you launch a satellite into space, according to 300-year-old Newton's laws and Kepler's, the dynamics are incredibly simple. I mean, they're so simple that even a high school kid can figure them out. That's how simple they're supposed to be. What happened with the first satellite that Wernher von Braun and his team of Operation Paperclip imported German Nazi engineers.
That was Explorer 1?
Explorer 1, back on January 31, the late evening, 10:48 in the evening Eastern Time of January 31, 1958. Think back how old you were then.
I was 8.
Von Braun launched this satellite into orbit. And the story we're going to then unfold for the rest of this 4 hours is what happened when it reached space and did things that no self-respecting Newtonian law-abiding satellite should ever have done.
And they didn't expect it.
They didn't expect it. They knew that it was incredibly impossible. And there was a conspiracy, which I'm going to demonstrate, to cover it up from the highest to the lowest levels of this government and the other governments, including the Soviet Union, including the Europeans, the Japanese, the Chinese. Everybody is in on the secret, except the ordinary, common, everyday guy here in the U.S. who paid for those missions and all the subsequent missions. And we're going to describe in detail what happened that night, what von Braun did following what happened that night, which lets us know that he knew it was incredibly impossible.
And we're going to do that in just a moment. Richard C. Hoagland, our special guest throughout the evening tonight. A little bit later on in the program, Joseph Farrell joins us to add his expertise. Then, of course, in the final hour, Richard and Joseph will take your phone calls right here on Coast to Coast AM. And welcome back to Coast. George Norrie here with Richard C. Hoagland. Richard, I guess for us to begin, we must start at the beginning as Operation Paperclip, these brains of Germany, so many of them Nazis, came over here with their knowledge. Go ahead.
Well, they were all Nazis. You know, I mean, there was nobody in Germany who couldn't be, because certainly if you had a position of responsibility, if you were involved heavily in engineering and science, helping Hitler win the war, helping the Reich, perpetuate its 1,000-year mythology, they didn't, for security reasons, let anybody in those positions do any of this amazing stuff that wasn't a Nazi.
Were they diehard Nazis, though, Richard, or...
See, that's what everybody keeps excusing these guys are. Of course they were.
Yeah.
Duh. What we did when we brought them over here is that we sanitized them. There used to be the term in the intel community called sheep dipping.
Uh-huh.
We sheep dipped them all. If you read their actual dossiers, if you go back and you actually read, which I've been able to do, because I've had my own researchers in the National Archives, extracting this paperwork for years, like Joseph has, as you'll see when we have him on toward the end of the show, you can actually read the U.S. Army intel guys who were, doing the interviews and basically trying to see whether these guys were going to be threats to the United States if they brought them over here. And the unwhitewashed version of von Braun's dossier, where he was a major in the SS, et cetera, reads very differently, with the interrogator basically saying could be security risk, et cetera, than the sheep dip version that we've all, been privy to because of NASA propaganda for the last 50 years.
All right, so the Russians beat us. How did they beat us? Did they get the better Nazis?
You mean they beat us in the space?
In the space.
No, they didn't. And this is another mythology which we don't really get into in part one. This is going to be a 3-part series, von Braun's 50-year-old secret. Part 1 is already posted on Enterprise.
Right.
Part 2, I literally finished 20 minutes ago. I sent it to Joseph to kind of read over because, he has the background that is,
sure,
their expertise in this. He's given me the green light, so sometime either during the show or at the very end, I'll post Part 2. Part 3 is going to be about some of the very strange politics that we've, again, been lied to. It is so obvious now that we let written them. There are all kinds of examples of twists and turns of history and fate and all the other misimpressions we've been given. History, as they keep saying, is written by the winners. Well, in this case, the winners are the ones who were in the White House, who were writing the history right after the so-called Sputnik surprise. We, the Eisenhower people, deliberately allowed Russia to beat us into space.
Because what?
Now, you want me to get into the politics of this first, or you want to back into it later?
Give me a highlight of it, because this fascinates me.
Is that Eisenhower was pushing very strongly what he called his open skies proposal. He wanted, because we were very concerned about the development of nuclear weapons and bombers and the beginnings of missiles in the Soviet Union, just like we were developing them here. That's why the paperclip guys were brought over to help the Army develop better versions of the V-2 so we could lob nuclear weapons at the Soviet Union and basically create what was called MAD, mutual assured destruction. If they started a fight, we'd clobber them, and if we started the fight, they would clobber us.
Nobody wins.
Basically the Mexican standoff. You got two guys standing in a pool of gasoline in a dark basement, and both have pistols, and if either one fires the shot, they both incinerate.
The Russians seem to have forgotten that in this latest incursion with Georgia.
Well, because it's a threshold thing.
Yeah.
They're only nibbling at their own borders. They're not threatening us directly, and we're not going to do anything. At least that's their
perception.
Reasoning.
Yeah.
So we had this standoff, and Eisenhower, because we had nothing in those days. We had basically ground-based human intelligence. That was it. We didn't have airplanes. We didn't have satellites. We didn't have ways to look down. We didn't have real independent technical, what they call national technical means to verify how many bombers, how many missile bases, how many missiles, et cetera, et cetera. We basically would count the missiles during the May Day parades in front of the Kremlin, which, of course, a lot of them were cardboard.
Yeah, that's right.
So there was this real effort on the part of Eisenhower, who was a general, remember, to get real intelligence. So he came up with this idea called open skies, where he basically put it up to Khrushchev. Look, if you open your skies to reconnaissance, we'll open our skies, and that way both sides will know what each other's got, and we won't go to war over a misimpression or an accident or a mistake.
Interesting.
And the Russians turned him down. Soviets kept turning him down. What he didn't want, in hindsight, and the historians now are kind of freely admitting this, it hasn't leaked out into the general mythos yet. What he didn't want was for von Braun and the Army guys to put up something called Project Orbiter, which had been begun as an idea in 1954. Remember, the Sputnik shock was in October 57.
Right.
In 54, they were discussing putting satellites into orbit. The Navy had some ideas. The Army had some ideas. The Army had von Braun, which was their ace in the hole. And he was very upset that he was turned down by McElroy, who was the Department of Defense Secretary, working under the White House, of course, under Eisenhower, and by Eisenhower himself, because the von Braun guys couldn't imagine why we would want to allow the Soviets to get ahead, and the Soviets had already published that they were going to launch a satellite. Now, the popular wisdom is that our guys didn't take them seriously. Oh, those stupid, backwards commies, they couldn't,
Yeah, and we got stuck.
Wrong,
we got
wrong,
caught.
wrong.
Not the case.
Again, more lies. What really was going on is that the White House deliberately would not let von Braun launch a military satellite over the Soviet Union because what they wanted was a civilian satellite, either by the Navy, under the guise of Vanguard, a separate private, research effort.
Mm-hmm.
Or, worst case scenario, the Soviets would do it first, and then we would not object. And if we didn't object, then in the court of public opinion, nationally, internationally, in the UN, et cetera, the open skies would certainly extend at least to satellite altitudes. And that would have given us the green light to fly over the Soviet Union territory with spy satellites that were on the drawing boards, Project Corona. The CIA was busily trying to put together a way to put spacecraft into orbit with film cameras. And then they would literally re-enter the warhead or the spacecraft and pluck the film out of the water,